Hey,
Hey, how are you?
doing great.
He's got the shirt. He's ready to go.
Yep.
All right. Well, good luck. Have a good talk. Take it away.
Thank you. Give me a second to share and set up the slides.
No problem. I'll let you know when your share comes on just to make sure we can see it.
Where did my Zoom window go? Here it is.
Okay, we can see it.
Hey. Sorry for that. I wasn't sure if I started at like 40 or at 20.
Oh, no problem.
So during this Laracon, you have heard and are going to hear a lot about all the different parts of Laravel, like queues, the container, the HTTP layer, broadcasting, commands, etc., and how they work in the context of real applications, how you can take advantage of them, and even maybe rebuilding them from scratch to try to understand the underlying concepts. And this talk is going to be a little bit different, since instead of like building an example application or something like that, we're just going to go into a new Laravel project, open the vendor file, and try to figure out what is going on in there. And this isn't to say we're not going to like learn anything useful, since understanding how everything works can save us a lot of time, especially when you hit some of those really weird tasks where you are not passing a parameter right or something, and it takes you through the whole stack until you find the specific function where you forgot to add a comma or something like that. And also seeing how things are implemented and how Taylor implemented things mostly can give us some really cool ideas for building abstractions and logic in our own apps. So before we get into that, I want to talk a little about who I am and why a random teenager on the internet is qualified to give a talk on framework internals. So hi, I'm Miguel, and I'll be 19 in 2 days. I started working on Laravel in 2016 and have contributed to the framework a little bit since. For example, if you've ever used the auth directive in Blade apps, that was me. And I'm also really active on Twitter in the Laravel community and in general, where I often share snippets on what I'm working on, cool hot tips of code that I find, and things like that. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Foundation and how Laravel kind of comes together. And you may be asking to yourself, okay, but what is Foundation? And if you have ever had to upgrade Laravel to a new version, you probably know it's required under Laravel/framework on your composer.json file. What you may not know is that this package is just a collection of smaller packages published under the Illuminate namespace. So when you are requiring the Laravel framework package, you are actually requiring all those different packages. So you probably know what most of these are. Maybe there are some that are like too small to have a lot of documentation in them. Like for example, the macrovolt class, the macrovolt package, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's just like one trait and it's extracted for reasons. Also hashing and stuff. Then we have the more common ones like the database and the container and stuff, which we have more info because they're more complex and so you can make a talk on them. And the cool thing about this approach is that it allows me to pull in packages individually. For example, for a few small test applications that I made, I just needed Blade, and so I could just compose require Illuminate view and just use that without having to use the entire framework. However, if all of these packages are made to be isolated, and so that if you want to pull in support, you don't need to pull in other packages, there needs to be some place where all the things that integrate these packages together live, and that is Foundation. It's also one of the most magic Laravel packages, with the source for, aside from booting up the entire framework, instant facades, package auto discovery, and a lot more cool things. So enough talking, let's dive in. So here I got almost brand new Laravel application. And you probably already know what the request lifecycle is, which is when a new request comes to this app, we bootstrap the kernel and we just send it to the router, capture the request, and send it over. And that's where it goes to the routing layer and everything that it was talked about before. Our journey, though, begins a little bit earlier when we require this app file, which lives on the bootstrap folder. And that app file is initializing a new instance of this application class, which is probably one of the most important classes in the whole framework. Since it basically takes care of registering everything, booting up the container, joining all the pieces together. And actually, if we check the handle method of this app, this is basically where the request is actually captured and sent to the kernel and everything. So let's see how Laravel prepares itself for all the requests and commands and everything that comes in. We go to the base kernel class. There's this kernel that we use to register middleware, and that extends another kernel, which is the one that our requests go through. And this kernel has a bootstrapper array, which acts similar to middleware, in that it just, instead of passing the request through all of these classes, it passes the app class that we saw earlier through all of them, doing some things in each of them in the specific order so that the application is loaded. The first thing that we do is to use a package called .env to load our .env file and populate all the environmental variables. And something that I actually discovered kind of while researching this talk, and I didn't know was possible, was that Laravel allows you to have specific environmental files. So for example, you can have your .env file, and then you can also have a .env.an environment, for example, .env.local, and this will also get loaded in when you are loading Laravel. So this is really useful, for example, for having a .env.testing that will automatically get loaded when you start testing. Once that's done, we are going to load our configuration. And this will check if the configuration is already cached, which of course means that we don't need to regenerate everything again. And if it isn't, it will load the configuration files, finding it from the directory. So this is a pattern that Laravel uses quite a lot, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, which is instead of having to manually register all the config files, it knows that there's a config directory, so it can just find what files exist on that directory, and that's basically the files we need to load. And once these are loaded and sorted, we go to the next one, which is handle exceptions. And this was a little bit confusing at first, because if you understand how Laravel works, there's basically Laravel is basically just a giant try-catch block, where here we run all the controllers and models and everything. And then if an exception happens, or any kind of throwable really, we just report it and render it. And so what do we need another handle exceptions theme for? So there are two things to keep in mind here. First of all is this part, where there are some instances in which PHP doesn't throw exceptions, but errors. For example, if you forget to add a semicolon, that's not valid PHP code. And so PHP will throw an error. And this takes care of basically catching all of that and turning errors into error exceptions, which will make sure they are actually shown by whoops or whatever, or ignition or whatever exception reporter we are using. And the other thing that's interesting in this file, it's this reserved memory hack, which is really clever. And the issue here is, let's say our application runs out of memory. What would usually happen is that we just get a blank screen with no information of what's happened. Because if there's no memory left, there's no way for the application to actually tell the user, show an exception, show a stack trace, say we've run out of memory. So what Laravel does here is reserve some memory. So it populates a string of just the X character of a few bytes. And then once an exception is handled, it empties that string. And so all that memory gets recovered, and we can use that memory to actually report the exception. So once that's done, we'll register the facades and aliases, which just clears the instances, make sure all the facades have access to the application and the container, and then uses aliases, which are a feature that I haven't really used that much, but it exists, which allows you to basically alias classes so that you can just say use app instead of use Illuminate support facades app. And it also takes care of auto discovery in some aliases, which is something that we will talk about after this. But yeah, gets them from the auto discovery and your app config and just registers them. Finally, it will register all providers, which just calls a method on the application. This will do two things. First of all, it will get your providers from the providers array in the app config, and it will make sure all the Illuminate ones are always first. And this makes sure that even if you messed up and you changed the order of some of these, and the providers in here require the other things to be active, Laravel will intelligently split this in two so that all the Illuminate providers are always loaded in first. And then it will do some magic to auto discover the packages from all the providers from all the packages we have installed, which again, I'll talk about later, joins them in and just registers them. And the final step is just to boot all the providers, which basically means going through all the providers and calling the boot method on that provider. Pretty easy. So that's how Laravel prepares itself for action and passes the request onto the HTTP layer for the routing system to take care of, or the command layer. As you can see, though, there are still a lot of unopened folders here and a lot of magic to go through. So one of those things that are really magical is package auto discovery, which, if you remember a few years ago, every time you installed a new package, you have to go in here and add the service provider manually. And then sometimes there were some gotchas where like some providers, you had to remove one and install another one, or you had to have them in a specific order. Then someone, I don't remember exactly who, PR'd package auto discovery, which just is thing Laravel does, where it looks through all the packages that we have installed and figures out the providers analysis they need and registers them automatically. So if we go to our Bootstrap cache page, there is this packages file, which just contains a list of all the packages that we have installed that have providers or aliases and their aliases. And if I clear this up and run composer dump, you will see that this comes back up. So this is regenerated. The way this is done is there's this post autoload script that is executed every time the autoload is dumped, which happens after you install, upgrade, whatever, which runs this package discover command, which leaves, it calls the build method of this package manifest class, which will look for a special file called install.json, which is generated by Composer. in here. And this basically contains all the package.json files of all the packages that we have installed. The full contents of their package.json files. So this will basically load all of that into an array and then check if any of those have an extra Laravel key. So we can see here, there's this package, Ignition, for example, has an extra key, and then that has a Laravel key, and then that defines some providers and some aliases. And so it checks if those exist. For the ones who exist, it checks if we have ignored them or if any of the packages have ignored them. And if they haven't, it just writes that up to the class. And then the application class, as we saw before, will it will load those in when it's also loading the providers that it found on our app config, and also the alias that we saw in the Bootstrap register facades. This will also pull in all the aliases from the package manifest. Okay, so we pretty much understand how Laravel recognizes third-party packages and loads them when booting the application now. Let's look at something a little bit more magical, which is instant facades. Instant facades allow you to create facades on the fly just by appending something to the namespace, facades in our case, but it's configurable. So as an example, I have made this controller. Oops. I think this is on the, here it is. So I have created this utils class, which just takes the HTTP Laravel HTTP client on the constructor, which should automatically get injected by the container, and then has a method for getting a fact about cats using an external API. To call this, I can just get an instance of that and just call the function in there. And I'm using the app or the container method because I want the constructor to get resolved through the container. So if we go to the, whoops, let's serve this instead. There we go. So if we call this up, we'll see we get stuff from the API, but it would be much cooler if we can do something like this, because we don't need to call the container manually or any of that thing. The issue with this is that our cat fact function is not a static function. And if we make it one, it will not get the client injected through the container. So something we can do is to just append facades to the namespace, and that will just make it work magically. So how does this work? When I first started looking into this, because I wanted to know how it was implemented, I thought this would probably live in the container, but it turns out it lives in Foundation, specifically in the alias loader. So this has a facade namespace registered, which is facades, and it will check if the class we are trying to access starts with that namespace, and if it does, it will call this load facade method, which will make sure if the facade already exists on this cache directory, and if it doesn't, it will create it using this facade. So if we go to stubs facade, it will generate a file similar to this, but replacing the namespace and class. And if we go to our cache here in the framework cache, we'll see it generates a facade for us. If I remove this and reload, it should generate it again. this is just one of the great examples of how awesome the developer experience in Laravel is and how well thought is everything. So let's take a little break from all that magic now to talk about a class that is probably one of my favorite classes on the whole framework. You probably know that you can run PHP Artisan Inspire to get a quote. This is an example of a command that is defined on the command routes file, which just calls a quote function in this inspiring class. And this quote function is a collection of quotes that fit the Laravel philosophy that have been curated over the years by Taylor and Folks. And I also really like it because it contains some traces of Laravel history in this comment in here, which gets edited by Taylor pretty rarely. Yeah, I just think it's like a really great representation of the Laravel philosophy of clean code, inspiring code. I think this was on the homepage at some point, like inspire something. I'm not sure though. I know it was on the page that showed up when you started a new Laravel project before. So moving on, as I mentioned at the start, Foundation is kind of the glue for all these different packages so they can have some shared interaction without actually having to require in each other so that they can be pulled independently. So, for example, we go to our models. The model our user extends from lives in Foundation because this implements part of the auth and part of the database and Eloquent and also some other things. Another thing that lives here is the authorizes requests trait, which gets pulled in by the default controller and allows us to call the authorize method on requests from the controller. And this is another really common theme on Laravel, which is adding functionality via traits. Another example would be the validates requests trait, which gets added to also the controller so that you can call the validate method in it. Another way Foundation may add logic on top of other classes is using macros. For example, in the Foundation service provider, we have this method that will register some methods on the request for checking if the signature of the request is valid for signed requests. And if you have never heard of macros before, allow me to explain because it's another of the most magic things that there is in the entire framework. Basically, Laravel has this macroable class which a lot of Laravel classes implement, like the request, Eloquent, the router, and lots more. And this uses a magic call method, __ call, which PHP will call when you are trying to access a method that doesn't exist on the class. So Laravel uses this to hijack that call. And if you have defined a macro that fits that method, it just sends that to the macro. And so you can extend classes, but without really extending them, just defining extra methods on them. And this is really nice because you can use this yourself. You can use it to improve or add functionality to Laravel. For example, inertia uses this to define route __ inertia so that you can quickly have routes that return in inertia views. And you can also add it to your own classes. And this was, I said I would talk about this later. This was separated to its own package. There's a Illuminate macroable package so that you can pull this in any package, even if it has no relation to Laravel. So you can just pull this in and offer this functionality to your package users or to your application users. So they can extend functionality and also access the base class, access protected methods and everything. It's really amazing. And while we're talking about magic stuff, I wanted to highlight what most likely is my favorite implementation of a feature ever. To demonstrate it, I've created a controller which will just queue a job. So I'm just going to start up my queue worker and dispatch that job. And it should be sent to the queue. After a second on a specific queue, like you have all these options that you can chain and then get applied. You can also do things like after response, which is really useful if you want to execute something immediately after you return, so the user doesn't have to wait. But the cool thing about this is maybe you've never stopped to think about how this works, but how is this implemented? Like you can switch up the order and this will still work. Or you can add more stuff or have less stuff and it will always work. And these methods have no real way of knowing if they are the last one on the chain or not. If I were to implement this, I would simply add dispatch call at the end, which would dispatch the job. But Taylor actually came up with a very interesting way of doing that, which is using another magic method called the distract method, __ distract. And this basically gets called when this method is erased from the memory. And we can see this by assigning this to a variable and then calling sleep. So if we call this now, we will see that it will take 6 seconds for the job to show up, because until the request ends, it is not going to free up this memory and dispatch the job. If we remove this, it will still get shown in 1 second, even after the sleep call. But anyways, I thought this was a really, really interesting implementation and something that I've used since a few times on my own projects and really improves the experience. This is just another way that Laravel makes a little change that makes your life a lot easier. So we're talking about patterns that Laravel uses to improve functionality or add functionality and improve developer experience. And one of the things that Laravel also does a lot is file auto discovery. We saw this before with the config files, where you didn't have to register every file in the config directory. You could just say, this is a directory, just load all the files in it. Another example of this is the console kernel. Like if you remember, there was a time where you had to register every command you created in this array. And then Taylor come up with this load method, which accepts a path, which will just use this finder class, which is part of Symfony, to loop through all the files, get the namespace from those files, and then check if those files are extend command and aren't abstract. And if they are, it just registers them, and you don't have to do that anymore. Another example of somewhere where this is used is when listening to events. Laravel now auto registers events so that events can specify their own listeners, and that gets pulled in automatically. So yeah. And another really cool thing that Laravel does is if we check the console file, these are all the commands you are used to. You will see a lot of files in here. Most of them are the make commands, like make listener, make mail, make model, everything. And all of these commands actually extend a really interesting command, which is called the generator command, which doesn't actually live on Foundation, but on console, which means you can pull it on your own packages and use it so that you don't have to implement all of this yourself. So if we wanted to add a command to our package that allowed us to create a new specific type of file, maybe we want to create an inertia view or a live wire component, we can just extend this generator command, and we need to implement the getStub method, which should return the contents of the stub. And a stub is basically just the file that will be generated. Like you can see, this is the test stub with a few placeholders for the namespace and the class. And then we also need the path, which is where that file is going to be once created. And we get the namespace that that class will have. Like here, you can see it takes the root namespace, which is defined in here, and then uses some option that we pass to decide if we want to put it on unit or feature. And that's it. That's everything you need. All the logic, all the creation, copying, replacing the placeholder, that's handled by Laravel itself. So it's a really, really easy way to implement something like this without having to reinvent the wheel. Another interesting command in here is the down command, which puts your application into maintenance mode. And there have been some optimizations in here recently, and you usually just were able to put it down and up. Now you can specify a redirect, render a view, and stuff. And the view render is really interesting because, as we will see in a second, it hijacks Laravel so that it doesn't need to go through the whole view of registering the application, running all the providers, the routes, and everything. It just goes directly to that view. But first of all, how does that work? How does our application know if we are on maintenance mode or not? So it looks for this file called down on the framework directory here. So you can see if I run artisan down, it will create this down file, which is just a JSON file containing all the options that we have specified. So for example, if we say down redirect test, this will include a redirect to test. And you may also have noticed this maintenance.php file appearing here. And if we go back to our Bootstrap app, before we create the application, or actually even before that, on the index.php, before we do all of this, we are checking if this file exists. And if it does, we are just going to require it. And this allows us to get the data. And if we are just rendering a view, we can just exit, for example, and this will throw in the redirect and stop the execution. So we don't need to do anything at all with Laravel. It's just taken care of by this file, which is a really nice optimization because it allows you to handle a lot more views in maintenance mode, for example. And finally, talking about all these cool things that Laravel does for you, like the generator command, there's another thing that that Laravel provides, which actually is not part of Foundation, but support. But I thought I would talk about it anyway, because I think some people may not know about it, which is this Fluent class. So this works similar to like Eloquent model, for example. When you are accessing properties on an Eloquent model, you are not really accessing properties on the class. You're accessing the properties that live in this attributes array. This is similar to how the array object class that the Taylor introduced or announced today works. And this Fluent class basically implements all of these PHP classes and interfaces so that you can access it like an array. And It also implements all these magic methods, the get, set, and also call, which is really interesting. Let me show you how this works for a second. So I'm creating a new instance of this Fluent class, and then I'm calling Fluent, and then a function called hello with a parameter world, and then by no. And then we're just going to use this method that returns the attributes array. So you can see this allows us to basically define properties instead of having to do Fluent hello equals whatever. You can just do this and chain them. And so this is a really cool class that you can extend for your configuration objects or whatever. And it will allow you to provide a much better interface for configuring stuff and dealing with properties and objects. While we are at it, you may have noticed this with method, which is a pretty simple method. It just takes whatever we pass in as the first parameter and then passes it to the second parameter, which is a callable. And then whatever it's returned on the second parameter, it's just returned. There's something similar to this helper that is called tab, which that's kind of the same thing, but instead of returning whatever it's returned in here, it returns what the first thing that you passed in. So you pass something to the callable and then return the thing you passed. And I'm talking about this because there's another thing called tappable, which is just a really simple trait that allows an object to tap on itself, which is kind of weird, but it would basically allow my object to do object tap, and then you do something with that object, and then the object is returned again, which can be really useful to clean up the interface and everything in some cases. So yeah, that's not really part of Foundation, it's more part of support, which by the way, you should definitely look at, because it's like all the helpers for Laravel live there, and it's pulled in by almost all other Illuminate packages. It's like the one that is not really, that all of them depend on, or most of them depend on. And there's a lot of things that you can get from here for your own use or for use on packages. Because if you are making a package for Laravel, chances are you are already requiring or have a dependency on this package, so you may as well use it. So there's plenty of other cool things hiding in the vendor folder, both for Laravel and for all the other packages that Laravel and your project depends on. But this is kind of where my journey as your guide is going to end. If you're hungry for more, though, I would really encourage you to pick a part of the framework or of a package that you want to know better and jump right into it. Just go to however you're using that package, the public implementation, click on that method and jump right in and try to understand what everything does. I've been doing it for years and I find it super fun. And you always end up learning something new, which is great. So yeah, thanks for going with me through this journey and all this code. If you haven't had enough of me yet, I'll be giving another talk on the Laravel Worldwide Meetup next Tuesday. And there I'll be explaining how those logging with Google, logging with Twitter, logging with Apple, whatever, buttons actually work, which is something that you may already be using via Socialite or Passport, but this will explain what the underlying principles are. And it will also explain how you can add sign-in with Touch ID or Face ID for iPhones and Macs and whatever to your existing Laravel apps in less than 5 minutes. So if you're interested in that, you should probably check it out. You can also follow me on Twitter. If you want to see all the things I'm up to, you can tweet at me to chat about Foundation. You can let me know how you enjoyed the talk, or you can wish me a happy birthday in 2 days. So yeah, that's probably going to be everything that I have. Have a great day.